Hey, I'm Cosmic Collar, and welcome to the first episode of Wrestling Game Rewind, a series where we do a detailed retrospective analysis on a wrestling game, detailing its development, how it was received at the time, and how it holds up today. To begin this retrospective, I wanted to start off with a game that I feel would best represent the series, and that game is WWF War Zone. I know, hold your applause now. I know everyone just adores this game. It's everyone's fan favorite, they really put it up there with the top, fuck it. Okay. You got me. I'm kidding. I know this one really isn't that popular. The graphics have aged horribly, and the gameplay a lot feel is very subpar, which makes you wonder why I would start off with a game like that. Well, you see, I think people are just too quick to write off this game. But if you actually take the plunge to research WWF Warzone, you would find that, despite its shortcomings, it actually has a lot of fascinating details surrounding its development, and it might even be looked favorably upon by its core audience. And that audience is wrestling fans from the late 90s. For that reason, I actually think this is the perfect game to start with. And if you disagree with that, you can suck a fat one, nerd. And by fat one, I mean one long, thick spaghetti noodle, because you need to stay healthy and carbs are vital for your brain to function, kiddo. So let's go ahead and jump right into this retrospective. WWF Warzone was the first ever 3D WWF game to be released, releasing on both the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. And also the Game Boy, but we're not talking about that one. Put that shit in the trash. I don't know if it's bad or not, but just put it away for now. You don't have to put it in the trash. Additionally, this game had a groundbreaking commentary system where they actually commentated your match, and they didn't just say random crap like they did in the arcade games.
Rocky Maivia is seeing double. Kane has him at his mercy, all the way to the top.
And most importantly, it was the first WWF game to feature the Create a Wrestler feature. This game featured a concise Attitude Era roster, including important guys like Stone Cold, The Rock, The Undertaker, and of course, the Headbangers. Additionally, part of the roster was already out of date upon the game's release. This includes people like Bret Hart, who left the previous year to WCW, Ahmed Johnson, who left the company earlier that year to deal with family problems, and Shawn Michaels, who was still with the WWF at the time, but he was the current commissioner and not a member of the active roster. Finally, the gameplay utilized a weird combination of motion inputs and a momentum system for its matches, which, well, we'll get into it, but it's pretty confusing. With all these factors, it's fair to say that it makes for an extremely interesting 3D debut for the WWF. But before we get into that, we need to discuss the development of this game. This game was developed by Iguana West and published by Acclaim. At the time this game was created, Acclaim and WWF had a contract where Acclaim had the exclusive right to publish WWF games on home consoles. This is based on, well, spoilers, this is based on a court document with the lawsuit between Acclaim and the WWF, where it stated that they entered the relationship on March 17th, 1988, and they continued to renew that relationship in January 25th, 1990, May 1st, 1991, April 21st, 1993, December 31st, 1997, and lastly, May 29th, 1998, which is the same year that this game was released. Would you look at that? Additionally, this is confirmed in a copy of Retro Gamer UK, where they made a quote saying that WWF WrestleFest went on to become American Techno's best arcade seller, and then it later went on to say that, sadly, Acclaim already owned the WWF license for home video consoles, so the WWF Technos franchise had to be kept in the arcades. This is why that for most of the 90s, we saw Acclaim have a stranglehold on WWF home console releases, and why we saw the aforementioned series like WWF WrestleFest never make its home console debut. So if you don't like the Acclaim games and you were hoping for something else, too bad, you got bent. Deal with it, nerd. The game started its development late 1997. We know this because of two articles in 97 detailing the upcoming release of this game. These two articles are an issue of Game Informer and an issue of GamePro. And so with this, we can probably assume that the game started its development like 2 or 3 months before. So, maybe like around, I don't know, August or June of 97 is when development started. That's just a guess, though. I don't know. It's somewhere around that mark. We know for sure it's 97, though. With work on the N64 port not starting until 6 months after development for the PlayStation port started. I'm assuming this because in an interview with Iguana West, where they discussed some of the development of the game, they stated that the game was in development for about a year and a half, and they explicitly said that the N64 version did not start its development until 6 months after the PlayStation 1 started. Additionally, in that same interview, they state that the game had about 20 people working on it, and for all you nerds out there, this game was written in C, with some assembly to help with the low-level graphics routine. So, shout out to my nerds. And also, fuck assembly. That class sucked. I'm glad I don't gotta do that shit anymore. Interestingly, this game was originally referred to as WWF 98. We know this because of the aforementioned issues of Game Informer and GamePro. and we didn't see this game be referred to as WWF War Zone until January 98. Also, if we take a little deeper dive into these articles I got pulled up here, we get some pretty funny and interesting things that we got going on here. So first of all, in the GamePro issue, we actually see that in the article they state that the game would feature ladder matches, cage matches, tag teams, and weapons around ringside. But this game doesn't have a ladder match. So ladder matches were either originally planned for the game, or this article just lied and they didn't know what they were talking about. Both of those could be equally valid. An article just being flat out wrong is actually surprisingly common with early game journalism. I guess even true now. Anyway, I won't get into that. Additionally, whoever wrote this article did not care for the arcade games because he said, quote, Acclaim brings its WWF series back to classics with authentic wrestling moves and away from the Mortal Kombat wannabe styles of past titles like WWF In Your House. So he's kind of talking mad shit over what most people would consider a better game. It's important to remember that how video games were discussed at this current time is that 3D games were just sort of considered objectively better than 2D games. There's a few different examples of how game journalists would discuss 3D games versus 2D games where they kind of showed this bias towards the new. But I think no video does it better than when, well, I'll just let the footage speak for itself.
Capcom versus SNK2 EO from Capcom for Xbox and
E-I-E-I-O. This game looks and plays exactly like Street Fighter did on the Super Nintendo 15 years ago.
I love this game.
You love this game because you're a hardcore gamer.
I love
and
this
you like
game.
this two-frame animation fighting baloney.
I love, and SNK, as we all know, has gone out of business, so there aren't going to be tons.
I wonder why, because they never updated any of their game or their graphics.
Yeah, so if you're a fan of these kinds of games,
two-frame animations.
I don't care about that.
Two-frame.
The action is great.
So yeah. I could go on for a while about how bad game journalism was, especially for wrestling games back in the day, but that's for another video. If we switch over to the Game Informer issue, which also announced the game as WWF 98, nothing really too funny here, but they do state that the game features, quote, 12 photorealistic wrestlers, like the ominous Undertaker and the not-so-ominous Goldust. So, again, you know, I can't be too harsh because it is 1997, but it's just funny how they refer to this game as being photorealistic, you know. And the last article I wanted to cover, granted, this article came out after the game was released, but there's too much good stuff to not go over it. So there was an article that, again, GamePro issue put out in August 1998 after the game's release, where they interviewed several wrestlers about their involvement with the game. These included Steve Austin, Cactus Jack, The Rock, and Triple H. So most of these are fairly basic questions. You know, they asked the wrestlers what their involvement with the game was, and all of them just said that all they really had to do was just sort of show up and get their face scanned, and that was really the end of their involvement. So I guess that's important to note that none of the wrestlers actually performed their own motion capture. I tried to see if there was any information on who could have done the motion capture for this game, but I couldn't really find anything like that out there. All of them were asked if they played video games growing up. Mankind said no. Steve Austin said, I played Pong. And The Rock said he's a pretty avid gamer, actually. But one thing I will say, in this game being, you know, currently in the Attitude Era, GamePro also felt it very important to ask, who's sexier, Sonny or Sable? The Rock gave a very good answer, which he says, I can't really do a Rock impression, bear with me. He says, The Rock feels like this, and you can put this in bold print. The Rock couldn't give two pieces of monkey crap about either of those two chicks. The Rock being an ace in the hole, that's my motherfucking goat, brother. That's what I'm talking about. The only thing that The Rock gives a shit about is getting that gold. You know what I'm saying? Hell yeah. Jumping back over to the interview with Iguana West, where they discussed some of the development about the game. What makes this game really unique compared to the other 3D wrestling games being released at the time, such as WWF SmackDown and WCW versus NWO, was that this game actually had its own engine built from the ground up for it, as opposed to those games where they both had either an existing engine that they were building off of or had another engine that they used as a base. This game's engine was built from the ground up just for it, and the only real leverage that it had is that it was able to use some assets from NHL Breakaway to help out with it. But, you know, considering that this is like the first 3D wrestling game that WWF put out and it also had its own engine, it seems like Iguana West was really planning for something like long-term with this series of games, which didn't really pan out. And the last thing I will say about articles surrounding this game is that IGN, then N64.com, put out a pretty gnarly synopsis of the game, and I couldn't find the original article, but apparently it was so bad that they had to put out an apology for it. And in the apology, I'll pull up some quotes for it here. Just for the record, while we do not necessarily take the sport of pro wrestling very seriously, we do appreciate it for its entertainment purposes, and we definitely like playing wrestling video games. Any derogatory statements made about pro wrestlers were meant to be humorous and not serious. With a site like N64.com, which is not a promotional site, but which rather a news/advocacy site, we have the ability to say what we want. A First Amendment right. You know, whenever everyone says, like, it's my First Amendment right to say something, you know they just said something fucking horrible, you know what I mean? Like, no one ever says, like, hey man, it's my First Amendment right, and I have to say, you have wonderful hair today. No one ever does that. It's always when they're being an asshole, they bring up their First Amendment right. Game journalism really sucked back in the day. Again, whole video for itself, but just gotta make a point of saying that. But with all that, on July 24th, 1998, WWF Warzone was released.
You want to do what I do for a living, son? Then step into the WWF War Zone. Go ahead, create your own wrestler. Just another victim for Stone Cold to take out. 4-player action, 4 more kicked. A piece of trash like you is going to get in the steel cage with me? All the moves in the world won't mean jack when you meet the Stone Cold Stunner. You want to survive WWF Warzone? Stay away from me. And that's the bottom line, because Stone Cold said so.
For the PlayStation, and then shortly after, on August 11th, it was released for the N64. Oh, and in June, the Game Boy Port was released. But again, we're not covering that shit. Put that back in the trash. I'm just kidding. Take it out. We don't need that. Doesn't have to be in the trash for now. Each version offers something a little different, so we're just going to start with the PlayStation 1 and then switch over and discuss the differences that the N64 one has. So first of all, this game features a total of 21 wrestlers, with 5 of them being unlockable, and of those 5 unlockables, 3 of those are just duplicates of other wrestlers already in the game, such as Dude Love, Cactus Jack, and Rattlesnake, which is just a Steve Austin with a different outfit. And before anyone fact checks me about Pamela, Pamela is not a playable character in this game. She's only accessible through Game Shark cheat codes or whatever. You can't unlock her in the game, and even when you do unlock her, it's just Sue the Ring Girl's model again. She's not a different character, trust me. Anyways, there's 21 wrestlers. Pamela is not one of them. Moving on. From there, the game also includes 5 game modes, which includes Challenge Mode, which is your typical arcade mode where you climb the ladder of 11 wrestlers to win both the Intercontinental title and the World title. There's Versus, which is just your regular one-on-one match. But what makes this interesting is that you don't actually get to choose who you face. There's only random select, which is pretty weird. Cage match, hardcore match, known at the time as just a weapons match, and a tag team match. As for the gameplay, the Acclaim engine is quite unique in that its system is based around motion inputs, and each member of the roster having their own unique inputs for their wrestling moves. To start, you just have your kick and punch buttons, which on their own do a kick and punch. From those, if you do a motion input, it'll give you a specific wrestling move if it lands. So for instance, for Kane, to do a choke slam, it's down, down, triangle. But it never gets more complicated than that. It doesn't go into the SPD motions, the half circles, or the pretzel motions, you know, it keeps it pretty basic. Then the counter for these moves is your block button. If you block one of those moves, it typically means you get to take your turn back. Though the frame data in this game is ambiguous, seeing each wrestler has their own speed, and some basic moves may be punishable for some, but not for others. Then to counter blocking, you can initiate a tie-up, which supersedes blocking, and it's this is where shit gets real complicated. So you enter a tie-up by pressing circle. From there, you can select a move that deals a damage on a scale from 1 through 9. Then depending on how blue the wrestler's name is, details how much advantage points their move gets, with it capping around a +7 advantage. So once you pick your move, the check goes as follows. If your move damage minus your advantage is less than your opponent's move damage minus your opponent's advantage, then you will win, and your selected move comes out. By the way, this is not mentioned in the game anywhere. I had to pull this out of the game's manual to figure out how the fuck this system worked. So if you got a loose N64 version of the game, you're just fucked and you will never understand any of this. So anyways, if you go for a damage 4 move and you have an advantage of 5 and your opponent has a white health bar, you officially put him in a checkmate situation where they have no option that is less than -1. Everyone following so far? No? Okay, cool. I'm gonna move on. But wait, there's more! To prevent, quote, cheesy players who would just spam 1 damage moves every time to win every interaction, they added additional factors, where 6 and 9 damage moves always beat 1 damage moves, 5 and 8 damage moves always beat 2 damage moves, and lastly, 4 and 7 damage moves always beat 3 damage moves, regardless of whatever advantage you might have. So, as you can tell, we got a really intuitive system here that makes perfect sense. Another interesting factor for the gameplay is that it allows for counters mid-move, sort of like what they have with the current 2K games, which is interesting as this might actually be the first time something like this has been implemented in a game, where you actually, have the chance to counter something mid-animation. However, I don't know if that's true because I'm not sure if another game that I haven't played has already done that, so I'm not going to make that claim. I'm just going to say it's a very early implementation of that system. So now that you know how to properly hurt your opponent, it's time to discuss the gameplay loop of an individual match. So when I was playing the game, this is the typical gameplay loop that I would have. As you land new moves, you gain momentum, as indicated by how blue your name is. The more momentum you have, the more damage output you have, and the more advantage you have on the aforementioned tie-up system. However, the more you spam a move, and the more your opponent blocks it, you lose momentum, and the audience will start booing you, causing a loss of advantage, and in extreme cases will even cause your opponent's health bar to completely replenish.
Listen to this crap!
However, once you get the health bar down, your opponent will enter a stunned state, which again is something that they use in the current 2K game, so interesting to see it used all the way back here. From there, you will have a limited time to decide how you want to take advantage of this stunned opponent. Again, they never really properly explained this, but from my perspective, there are 3 ways this will typically go down. The first one is placing your opponent in a rest hold of some kind, which will cool all momentum, but will help you increase your health bar. You can do something really hype, such as doing a move off the top rope, which will give you a lot of momentum going into your opponent's next health bar. Or 3, you do nothing productive, and you gain no advantage, and momentum is completely cooled down. Then on Wake Up, your opponent has a few different options. Firstly, they can go for a Wake Up uppercut online Ryu style, or they can go for a Wake Up tie-up, or they can do nothing, I guess. For Okazeme, you get, none. There are no meaties, and you don't really get any real options on your opponent's Wake Up, as they have the frame advantage on Wake Up, so your only real option is to block. But then your opponent can read that and go for a Wake Up tie-up, but if you prioritize getting momentum, that's actually putting your opponent in a bad situation, so really just hold block on your opponent's Wake Up, as you have no real options besides that. Once you degrade your opponent's 20 health bars, and you get to that last red one, you can finally do your finisher by entering a tie-up and doing the input for your finisher, and then finally going for the pin. So before we can better discuss this gameplay loop and form sort of a strong opinion on it, I feel that it's important that we first understand the intentions of the developers when they created this game. As stated in their interview, they were quoted saying they wanted the game that was a wrestling simulation, as opposed to a arcade-style wrestling game. And as an aside, it's really interesting how this early in wrestling games being created, there are already discussions of arcade-style versus simulation-style wrestling games, a debate which continues to this day. And then when they say that, it makes the gameplay loop make a bit more sense. This is because in a match, before you start building more momentum, you really can't pull off any big, exciting moves. You gotta play it safe and go for your arm drags, your punches, and your kicks. And it's not until later in the match, when you have more momentum, you can start going for the big, flashy moves, like your choke slams and your moves off the top rope. Which, the more exciting moves you do, the more you degrade your opponent's health bar, which then culminates in your finishing maneuver. So with how these matches are structured, you can definitely see how they lean towards a more simulation style of wrestling match. Though speaking of their goals, let's talk about their other goal when making this game, and that was making one of the most realistic looking wrestling games on the market, as other wrestling games were simply not doing that. And they set out with this by implementing motion capture animation instead of hand-done animation, which it's really hard to discuss this from someone talking about the game 15 years after its release. As of course to me, the game visually doesn't hold up. But truthfully, neither do most games where their goal was to be as, quote, realistic as possible. When that is the visual goal of a game, the graphics tend to not hold up over time. Though I don't think it's really fair to judge the game based on that. I think in order to properly judge this, we need to take a look at reviews of the game when it was released. However, that's a whole segment later on, so we'll save that for then. Now that we discussed the gameplay loop of your average match and also how the game looks, let's, I guess we'll just jump into the game modes. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. To start, we have the challenge mode, which, as stated previously, is your typical ladder-based arcade game crawl thing. You fight someone, you win, you fight the next person on the ladder, so on and so forth, until you beat the last person, at which point you stay at the top and beat whatever random challenger comes your way. Oh, and you can also unlock stuff like new wrestlers, such as Sue the Ring Girl, Big Head mode, No Bitches mode, which disables block, and burp and fart mode. Very crucial mode there. The only real major twist with this mode is that during your climb, another wrestler you already fought can challenge you and will be introduced through a promo of that wrestler.
You made the biggest mistake of your life. I'll be destroying. I will be naming, and I will be mowing it.
From there, you either fight in a cage match or weapons match, and after you win, your reward is to continue the ladder like nothing happened. So I guess the reward was being able to just play that match type to offer some variety for the climb. Glancing through those match types, cage matches allow you to Irish whip your opponent into the cage, and the win condition is climbing out of the cage. You can also just jump right off and do something real hype, you know? And then the weapon matches allow you to pick up weapons and, you know, hit people with them. Very self-explanatory. But, you know, during that, fans will throw weapons into the ring, and it is pretty funny hitting someone with a big TV. So, I can't complain too much. And then lastly, we have the tag game mode, and it's a tag match. Fascinating. Lastly, before moving on from game modes, I think it's crucial we talk about the Create a Wrestler feature. This feature made its debut in Super Fire Pro Wrestling 3. Though, as stated previously, this was the first ever WWF game to feature it, which, even for the first implementation of this feature, it honestly has everything you'd want. You can modify the body type, the face, which the faces just look like face scans of the developers. You can change the skin color to be a big green freak if you want, and it has a wide variety of clothing options. Funnily enough, they implemented many ways to create wrestlers who weren't in the WWF at the time. They had Dusty Rhodes gear, fucking Doink the Clown's gear, Sparky Plug, the Patriot. Who else would you want to make? So even though by today's standards, these features might not seem extraordinary, but for this being the first of its kind, it really set the tone for how the Create a Wrestler feature should be going forward. So I gotta give it 2 big thumbs up for that. Also, I want to quickly cover the sound effects of this game. Now, normally I wouldn't talk about the sound design of a game unless there is something noteworthy to say. And this game does in fact have something noteworthy to say, as I believe this game takes a huge step forward in sound effects for wrestling games. So even though other wrestling games featured wrestlers grunting and going, ugh, when they got hit, and some commentary quips of Vince McMahon going, oh my god, here we go! This, I believe, is one of the first wrestling games that has sound effects that dynamically change as your match goes on. So when your opponent gets stunned or you land a finisher, the commentary will have an actual line to coincide with that event.
Locking horns now. Off the rope. Bret Hart is seeing star.
Instead of, again, just a random, oh my god! Additionally, the crowd will change as the match goes on. So the more momentum that you build, the crowd will cheer you on more, and if you're a specific wrestler, they'll have a specific chant for it. So like with Steve Austin, they'll go, Stone Cold! Stone Cold! And vice versa, if you're losing momentum, they'll start booing you.
Listen to this crowd! What's going on here? I can hardly hear myself talk.
Additionally, they'll screen some random shit based on who you're facing, which is pretty cool. Get it, Brad! Oh, I will say that some of the wrestlers' grunts are more annoying than others. I'm looking at you, Mankind.
There was a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest.
The actual sound effects themselves are your standard affairs of, you know, punches and kicks and all that stuff. But in terms of the implementation of these sound effects, I consider them first in class for the time. That's basically everything the PlayStation version offers, but one must ask, how does it compare to the N64 game? Well, the N64 game removes those full motion promos to save space and instead replaces them with the wrestler punching a sandbag and saying a one-liner.
2 words, suck it!
Fucking epic. To make up for this, they introduced 2 new game modes. A gauntlet mode, which is just trying to survive as many people as possible in a row with 1 health bar, and then a Royal Rumble mode, where you can use certain moves to throw them over the top rope. Pretty neat. So that concludes the game discussion segment, and now we'll move on to the review segment. So for this segment, we take a look at all the reviews for this game throughout the years and sort of get like a general gauge of how the game was received then and how it's received now. For that, we will have 3 different scores. The first score being how the game was received at the time of its release, the second being the current feelings of the game, and the last being my personal score. So let's just go ahead and jump right into it, starting with the reviews from the past. So rather than going through each article, I'm just going to summarize the general points found throughout all these reviews. However, before I do that, let me at least read a few funny quotes I found while doing this research. 100% whoop-ass! Stone Cold's in it. Enough said. So this review might be a little biased. The only thing missing is the steroids. So fun, you would trade in a night with Sable to play it. So again, to speak to the quality of game journalism at the time, a highly respected and sought after game was seen as above or equivalent to a night of intercourse with a woman you don't know. So again, if it's not abundantly clear, game journalism at the time was clearly at an all-time high. So with that being said, the overall score is quite high, actually. The highest score that we saw out of this was a 9.75 out of 10, aka the 4.875 out of 5, and the lowest score only being a 6 out of 10, aka the 3.5 out of 5. And if we combine all of these scores, we see that the average score is an 8.2 out of 10. So you can see that out of all these reviews, the game was very well received, receiving really high praise for a lot of different factors of the game. Additionally, we can see a lot of common themes throughout all these reviews. I mean, the two most obvious ones are that every single review pointed out how good the graphics are. So when they said their mission statement was making the best looking wrestling game, they 100% achieved that goal. Additionally, even though it wasn't their goal, they knocked the sound design out of the park for these reviewers. These reviewers all felt the need to point out how good the sounds were. So those two factors were huge ups for the game. But also, you can't overlook the fact that a lot of reviewers felt the need to point out the Create a Wrestler functionality, which, you know, I would agree that is a very important thing that they added to this game. And it's something that's become a staple in all WWE games, or fuck, even all wrestling games for that matter from here on out. So the fact that this game kind of defined that standard, you gotta give it a lot of props for it. And yes, I know it existed in other games before it, like the Fire Pro series. However, you can't really overlook that this game clearly had a strong impact on WWF games or WWE games, incorporating that Create a Wrestler feature for basically, I think, 100% of the games after this. Looking through these reviews, the only real criticism that we sort of saw throughout it was a few reviewers not really enjoying the control scheme and some minor issues with the gameplay. But overall, from my perspective, this game knocked it out of the park on its release. But that was the historic look at the game. One must wonder, how does this game hold up by today's standards? Well, let's go ahead and jump right into that. So for the current opinions of the game, I did this by accumulating two different opinions of the game. The first being modern day reviewers and how they felt about the game. So because I don't have a lot of reviews to work with, it's kind of hard to generalize the opinions throughout these reviews, but I can at least highlight a few of the points found, which includes unintuitive controls, graphics not holding up very well, Create a Wrestler and sound both being pretty good for the time. Overall, these reviewers seem to have found the game pretty mediocre, as seen with the highest score being a 3 out of 5. And then additionally, I went to the people, and by me going to the people, I mean I found an old Reddit thread of people's general opinions of the game. Reading through the Reddit thread, it was really mixed between people who played it as a kid, who still loved it, and gave it like 8 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10, having really strong nostalgia for it, and people who have zero nostalgia to cloud their judgment, giving it a very low score. So looking through the Reddit thread, I found that the average of all these opinions came out to about 5.5. So accumulating all these current reviews from both the official reviewers and the Reddit thread, the final average score came out to be about a 5.3, which sounds about right. Now, finally, time for my review, and I actually have a lot to say about this game. So starting with the gameplay, I personally do not care for the gameplay. I really don't find the input system to be very fun. It actually made me not want to explore a lot of the roster, as I really didn't want to learn all their moves. Though with that being said, discovering their moves isn't the hardest thing. You can just sort of guess quarter circles and down, right movements, and you'll get something on accident, but it still actively dissuaded me from exploring the other characters that this game had to offer. Secondly, I found the wake-up system in the game to be rather frustrating at first and boring after. At first, I would try and get some good okizeme on them, you know, trying to find like a good way to punish them on wake-up or to keep my momentum going, but after playing through the game a lot, the most viable option is just to block your opponent's smash move and then either punish them afterwards, or they would do a wake-up grapple, but then you would enter that system with an advantage. So really just holding block on wake-up was the only good option, at least playing against CPUs. As we kind of discussed before, I went over a lot of the mechanics of the game, such as the wake-up system, the tie-up system, the momentum system, your health, all that stuff. And once I understood the mechanics of the game and how they all sort of work together, the game went from really frustrating and confusing to fine. Like, even when I understood everything and I was able to implement it all in a match, I still didn't find that fun. It wasn't frustrating, just it was okay. It's not really a game that I would invite my friends over to play. You know, this isn't like a game like, I'm just gonna throw a random game out there, like Day of Reckoning, where I'm like, oh, this is like a great game to toss the controllers around and have a great time with my friends. It's a game with a really steep learning curve, and your reward for climbing that curve is a really mediocre wrestling game. Hardcore matches, they can be fun, you know, I won't deny hitting someone with a big ass TV isn't funny, like that's wicked funny. I wish more wrestling games had big ass TVs for me to hit people with. The cage matches are okay. It's definitely fun jumping off the cage, but you know, that's fun in any wrestling game. The tag team system is horrible, with your opponent being able to summon their partner whenever, so you can play around this by trying to survive and then summoning your partner after, as their cooldown is still going. But again, I see the balance and how these systems could work, but even then, it's just not very fun. A big selling point of this game were the promos that the wrestlers do in between the challenge run, which I found them to be funny at first, but they kind of lost their charm after I had to do multiple playthroughs of the challenge mode. And I found myself just sort of mashing through it as I was trying to speed run the challenge mode just to unlock shit. I think it's something that you don't really need to play the game to experience. You can just look up the promos on YouTube and you would get the same experience. If anything, it would be a better experience because then you can get what you want and not to play WWF Warzone. That's really harsh, but it's kind of the truth. My overall feelings after letting it sit is that it's not a game I would really ever want to play again. After getting all the footage for this game, I really doubt I would pop this in for another session unless I need more footage for something else. So I think for me personally, I'm gonna slap it with a 4 out of 10. It's not a completely incompetent game, and I do respect for what it was going for, but it's just not something that I particularly enjoy. But having the affection of your peers only gets you so far, right? Let's talk about something that lasts forever. Money, money, money. So this game, as we discussed previously, had amazing reviews when it came out. So how did the sales fare? Was this game a financial success? Which some would argue is more important than being a critical success. And looking through some old sales, we see that the game sales were incredible. A press release by Acclaim stated it was the largest launch in the company's history, and they struggled to keep up with demand for the game. To add to this, the game was at the top of the rental charts for a really long time. And to cap off the great sales of this game, how did the WWF reward them? You guessed it, by canceling their contract. In a very WWF manner, shortly after Acclaim started development on WWF Attitude, WWF went on to cancel their contract, which later on led to a little legal scuffle between the WWF and Acclaim, as Acclaim continued to manufacture and sell games such as WWF War Zone, Attitude, In Your House, etc., against the will of the WWF, which WWF went on to sue them, and that was a whole thing, and blah blah blah. But yeah, WWF was like, thanks for the money, nerds, now get bent. We're with this new company now, they're gonna make No Mercy, which everyone's gonna love. So, with all that, let's finally jump into the conclusion. WWF Warzone, despite not being a game I particularly care for, I still find that there is a lot to really admire about this game. For starters, I think it's really cool that this is the only wrestling game produced by a major wrestling company at the time to use its own home-built engine. Additionally, even though, again, I don't really care for the systems that are in this game, such as the implementation of the motion inputs or the complicated tie-up system, there was clearly a lot of thought put into it, and it wasn't just this shoddily built wrestling game with punches and kicks and an occasional suplex like we saw in a lot of old wrestling games back in that age. Also, the full motion video promos, the graphics, and the sound design was all fantastic for the time. And lastly, the introduction of the Create a Wrestler feature proved to be one of the best features in WWE games going forward. Considering all of that, I find that the game is clearly not something slapped together. I think it's very obvious that there was a lot of work that went into this game, and even though it's not for me, those efforts clearly paid off, as the game was wonderfully received on its release, and it still has groups of fans who grew up on the game and still love it. And also, the game was a huge financial success, so in the court of public opinion, it might not be a very good wrestling game, but in the court of the game being successful, it's guilty, or innocent. It was good for the time, alright? Look, that metaphor got lost along the way, I tried. So that completes the first game of this retrospective series. I think the next one is going to be another set of 3D games that came out around the same time. Some that I have not played, but I have a feeling I will thoroughly enjoy. Anyways, catch you guys next time. Peace out.